G'day guys, it's Adam here, the Australian Aquarist. Welcome to my fish shed. I realised in making videos I haven't done one yet as a tour of my fish space. All around the walls at one stage there I had racking for breeding Australian native rainbow fish. And then I made one change, and that was with this 600 litre glass tank over here. With this tank here I decided to make it marine. And I had kept marine before up in far north Queensland, but it had been a while. That one change started it all. I've got a permit with fisheries here in New South Wales to collect my own aquarium fish, and I go out and do a lot of snorkeling and diving. I explore the oceans and the rivers and the estuaries and mangroves, and I love doing that. And in the process I do bring fish back for my aquariums. But one thing I love to do is actually see fish in an environment that's to scale, or as best as possibly can be to scale. I hate seeing a surgeonfish or a moon wrasse just pacing backwards and forwards in a small 4-foot tank. So that's driven me to build some fairly large aquariums so I can sit down and relax and enjoy seeing the fish behave as naturally as possible. So what I actually did in the process was I stripped the back and side panels out of my 7-foot, 6-foot and 4-foot tanks, and combined with plywood, I then built these two tanks here. So we're going to have a bit of a tour of my setup. You can see also just outside here I've got my Australian native rainbow fish and turtle tank, which is outside. We'll go through that shortly. But I think we should begin with where this process all started, and that is with this tank over here. Righto, so a bit of rapid fire information about the tank. As I said before, it's 2.1 by 1.2 by 600 millimeters high. The reason this tank is 600 millimeters high, I'd love it to be higher, is that this panel and that panel back there were the front and back of a 4-foot tank. This panel there and that panel there were the front and back of a 7-foot tank. So the glass itself is 10 mil glass, and the height was dictated by those two tanks that I stripped down. This was the first tank I built using epoxy and plywood as the base. Got a video which I'll link at the end of this. It's all about building plywood tanks. You can get some good information out of that if you wish to tackle the project yourself. Basically, the base of this tank is a lamination of 2 sheets of marine plywood, 2 sheets of 18 mil marine plywood, with the top sheet set back by the thickness of the glass, which is 10 mil. And it's obviously epoxied using my favourite epoxy, and with this faceboard around the edge it actually sandwiches and creates that valley for the glass to drop down into. This tank was a great learning exercise for me, but it's also the one that's caused me the most regrets. I was doing it, as a lot of us probably do projects, I was doing it in a bit of a hurry. I was doing it just before Christmas. And the realisation in Australia that come Christmas time in January, all suppliers and shops shut down for a good 3 or 4 weeks. And I had to make some choices based on its construction with that in mind. The biggest regret I've got is in the way I use this aluminium angle as the bracing. You can see around these joints you get lots of salt crystals building up, and eventually it just starts to actually, I feel, pit away, and potentially, particularly along this edge here, potentially breach the condition of the aluminium and create some possible toxic effects into the water. Like I said, I've done an ICP test, but at this stage there's no aluminium levels which are elevated, but it does worry me. I did actually treat the aluminium first with a appropriate sealer. Being that time of year, I did it using a sealer from my local hardware store, and I wouldn't recommend doing that because it's just not good enough. I would have used glass strips, but again, being just before Christmas time, I was going to have some troubles getting a local glazier to actually cut those bracing strips for me. And being a 4-foot wide tank, I didn't really want to have great big chunky pieces of glass going across the middle. It would take up a fair bit of space. So I kind of thought utilising this aluminium flat bar, in this case it's a stainless steel cable, might be a bit less intrusive. So that's regret number one. The second regret I've got is the quality of the glass. I've since been getting some brand new glass cut for me from local glazier, and I must admit, seeing lovely new glass, it's absolutely amazing. The clarity and the condition and the arrowing of the edges is beautiful. See the scratches there, and the algae just gets stuck into those scratches, and it does make it a little bit hard to actually clean, and it just does. Once I've seen the brand new glass, I've gotten used to brand new glass again. It's become a little bit hard to ignore. It might be very hard to see, but there is that sort of pitting, and that, there you go. Look at that down there, and that's not, I've actually cleaned that glass this morning. That's just that sort of corrosion you get from old glass. I'm not 100% certain about the longevity of this tank in my display. The tank is drilled through the base. Just down in here, there's actually a standpipe, and that's a suction line for a 15,000 litre Laguna pump, which is just out the back there, and it shoots water back. So it's a closed loop for circulation. Plywood sump, which has been epoxied and also polyurethane. Big Aquamatic skimmer, sulfur denitrifier. One thing that I do run on this tank here is a ultraviolet light sterilizer. This is a 120 watt UV sterilizer. One thing I also love to use is a good old Inkbird temperature controller. I don't get into controlling and gear, but I do love that Inkbird to switch on the heaters, switch them off, and also switch on the fan for cooling if need be. The rock that's inside the tank I've actually built myself. There's a few natural pieces in there as well, but a lot of the rock is actually built using a combination of shell grit and fine sand and white cement, which I then cured in a local creek to leach out as much of the lime as possible. And that was been quite successful. The front gravel is actually shell grit. A lot of the areas around this side of the tank I've actually left bare bottom, and I'm slowly growing a carpet of the zoanthids or Palithoa and the Rhodactis across the base. The other thing I'd say about being outside in this shed is that I can make mess. That's one thing I really love, because I did have some tanks inside the house at one stage, and my wife would always get quite upset, despite the fact we had concrete floors, about water being spilt. And I'm a little bit messy. So I love being out here. I've got a drain just down the corner of the shed there, which I can hose out. And the other thing you might have noticed about the stands is that these stands are all basically stacked concrete blocks. So there's no chance of rust, there's no chance of rot, and I can just get the hose in here and splash around, and there's no problems whatsoever. After a previous video I did on how to choose the best fish food for your aquariums, I mentioned that one of the two foods that I exclusively use is from an Australian company. It's called Frenzy Fish Feeds. And I've started to develop a very, very new tentative relationship with these guys, but it's really exciting. It's really exciting. So in case you're wondering, that's Frenzy Fish Feeds. This is the large 6mm size pellet I use for my estuary tank and for my turtles. But I'm pretty excited. This is an Australian company. The ingredients in these fish feeds is amazing. So I hope you've watched that video and you've learnt to read the ingredients list and check out those first 4 ingredients on the ingredients list. Do that, check this one out. So they're based down in Tasmania, and they make feeds for aquaculture, they make feeds for aquarium fish, but they're also behind the scenes playing with live foods, they're playing with insects, they're playing with macroalgae, kelp, spirulina, duckweed, and they're aiming to put out a whole range of different feeds that includes not only the pellets but also potentially flake and also potentially gel-based feeds that includes all those amazing ingredients. So, and this is an Australian company. Let me just say it again, this is an Australian company. They do have a new style of packaging that's going to be coming out. It looks something like this, and it's the same good product, just different style of packaging. They're a very young company, and they're just growing and building. So I really think we should get behind them and support them. They've been very kind to send me a whole range of samples here from a 0.5 millimetre pellet up to a 9 millimetre pellet. And what I would do is I'll break open these packets in the next video, and we'll go through the different sizes and what we think we could use this sort of pellet for. So check them out. You won't find them in the pet store. You're only going to find them online. Buy directly from them. It's free shipping, and the prices of this fish food's amazing. Like, seriously, it's amazing. So you'd be mad as an Australian aquarist not to check them out. So where to now? Well, after I built that tank, I decided that I wanted to try something bigger, as you do. So I decided to build this, and this is my estuary tank. It contains some of my favourite animals. So I'm actually really happy with this tank. I spend actually a lot of time sitting in front of this tank. I think because it's so long, being 3.6 metres, it actually provides me with that sense of scale that I love to watch. The reason it's 3.6 metres is that this glass panel and this glass panel is the front and back of a 6-foot tank, 3.6 metres. And that panel there is the front panel from a 4-foot tank, so it's 1.2 metres. So it's 12 foot by 4 foot, and again 2 foot or 60 centimetres high because of the height of those tanks. So that means that these two panels here are separate. It's not one continual pane of glass. I bridge that internally with a glass bridge and externally with a timber bridge, and it's got that bracing piece of, again, aluminium that goes all the way down the tank. I actually really like watching this tank. I spend a lot of time sitting in front of it having a cup of coffee or a morning tea. I think it's because of the sheer size of it being 3.6 metres long. The fish can actually truly extend their fins, so to speak, and get some pace up, especially the trevally. And it's, you know, watching the little surgeonfish pecking away, and Monster there, my favourite eel, just lounging around in the driftwood. It's very relaxing, despite the fact that it's not a coral tank. So it's quite interesting. Its biology comes and goes a fair bit. I mentioned about the deep sand bed. I'll get occasionally a bacterial bloom that might come from having some of the driftwood in the tank, and then that'll subside, and the biofilms will grow on some of the driftwood. So it's actually a fairly successful replication of what I see when I do go snorkeling around the breakwalls and the marinas of Coffs Harbour. So in that sense, it's been very successful, and I actually wouldn't change any part of this tank. I really like it. If you have interest in setting up a different style of marine aquarium, such as an estuary style like this one here, check out these videos that I've got about using driftwood in an aquarium, in a saltwater aquarium, and also about just some of the inhabitants I've got in this tank.